The prairie wind howled like something half-starved and half-crazed, but Maher Red Willow didn't hear it. All she heard was the crack of the bullet snapping past her ear. Then another, splintering the wood of her wagon wheel. The reins were wrapped tight in her cracked hands, the two mules straining against their harness, hooves slipping in the dry, baked earth. She was 12 miles from Thunder Ridge Ranch, 12 miles from home, and they weren't just here to talk. The land itself was dying. The spring that fed her cattle was just a whisper now, and she could taste the coppery, stale sickness in the air, like old blood. The barrels in her wagon sloshed low, her last run to a riverbed that was now more bone than water. But the drought wasn't an act of God. It was an act of a man. Clayton Sable. She saw them through the dust. 3 riders, maybe 4, dark coats and wide-brimmed hats. Sable's hounds. Well-dressed, well-armed, and well-fed on the misery of others. Her pulse hammered against her ribs. She cracked the reins. The mules lurched forward, but the wagon was heavy and the road was a graveyard of stone and roots. Another shot rang out. Her left mule screamed, a high, terrible sound. It stumbled, blood pouring from its neck, steam rising as it hit the sun-baked ground. The wagon tilted violently, horribly, and the world became a tumble of sky and dust and blinding pain. Maher was thrown. Her shoulder slammed against a stone, knocking the breath clean from her lungs. She coughed, tasting dirt, trying to push herself up. But a rope snapped tight around her boots. She was dragged backward through the grit, the world scraping past in a blur. Then came the voice, the kind of voice that made dogs whimper and babies stop breathing. Could have settled this civil, Red Willow. It was Hatchet Harry Pike, Sable's favorite dog, the kind of man who smiled when he heard things break. He leaned from his saddle, the sun glinting off his teeth, twirling the rope like it was a game. "Last warning," he sneered, his face a mask of cruel delight. "Where's the flow being kept?" Maher didn't answer. She didn't have to. Her eyes told him everything he needed to know, hatred, defiance, and a grief so deep it boiled into an unspoken curse. Harry laughed. He liked that look. He raised his arm, ready to bring the whip down, and then came another sound. Gunfire, but it wasn't theirs. A single shot cracked through the air, sharp and clean and final, like the judgment of God. Harry's horse screamed, rearing up in terror. The rope went slack. Harry cursed, fighting to control his mount as it thrashed and bucked. Maher rolled, gasping, crawling toward the scant cover of a fallen cottonwood. Another shot. Then a blur. A figure launched from a painted Mustang, a ghost of motion against the dying sun. He landed between her and the chaos, a rifle already raised to his shoulder. He moved like he was born of the earth itself. Worn buckskins, long black hair tied back, the sharp, unyielding features of the Lakota, the people this land once called kings. His face was etched with hard lines, but his eyes burned with a living fire. "You move now," he said, his voice low and calm amidst the gunfire. He crouched beside her, his English clean, accented like river stones tumbling over each other. She nodded, her lungs on fire, her heart a drum against the dry earth. The stranger counted shots like a surgeon measures cuts. 3 down, 1 flanking. His gaze flicked to the chaos, then back to her, sharp and intense. "When I run," he said, "you run too. Get to that wagon. Make the mule run." He paused, his eyes locking onto hers. "I can't. You can." Those 2 words weren't barked as an order. They were given like medicine, or a fundamental truth. There was no room for quitting in his eyes, only survival. The gunfire paused for a heartbeat, the sound of men reloading. He moved. Lightning. That was the only word she could think of. He sprinted toward her crippled wagon, drawing their fire as he zigzagged across the open ground. A bullet caught his shoulder. He grunted, a sharp exhalation of pain, but he didn't stop. He didn't even slow down. Maher ran. Pain screamed from her ribs, from her shoulder, from the scrapes on her face. Her boots slid on loose gravel. She scrambled, clawed her way forward, her only focus the wagon. She reached it just as the stranger jumped into the driver's seat, bleeding, but steady. She didn't hesitate. She slapped the remaining mule's flank with all the strength she had left. The beast bolted. Behind them, shouts turned to fading curses. The dust swallowed them whole, erasing the blood and the violence from the road. They rode hard, not looking back until the world turned quiet again, tucked between the bluffs and wild sage of Black Hollow. Only then did they stop. "You're hurt," Mare said, her breath ragged. "Been worse," he replied, clutching his bleeding shoulder. His face was pale beneath his tanned skin. She looked at him again, really looked at him this time. The man who appeared from nowhere. The man who ran into gunfire for a stranger. "You saved my life." "Name's Wakiza," he said simply, as if it explained everything. "It means desperate fighter." She almost smiled, but the pain in her ribs was too sharp, the memory of the rope around her ankles too fresh. "Thunder Ridge Ranch?" he asked, his eyes scanning the path ahead. "You know it." "Sable talks about you," he said, his gaze returning to her. "The widow with a stubborn streak. One hell of a reputation." She looked away toward the setting sun. That reputation had cost her more than anyone knew. "That spring," Wakiza continued, his voice dropping lower, "it doesn't just feed your cattle, it feeds ours too." Maher's head snapped up. "What Sable's stealing?" Wakiza said, his eyes hard as flint. "He's stealing from all of us." Maher exhaled slowly, a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "I thought it was just greed," she murmured. "But this is war." Wakiza nodded, a single grim motion. "Then you need allies." They rode in silence as the sun dipped low, painting the land in gold and blood red. The kind of terrible beauty that mocked pain by being so damn indifferent. As they neared the familiar outline of Thunder Ridge, Wakiza said one more thing, his voice barely a whisper against the wind. "This river doesn't forget, Maher, and neither should you." She invited him into the ranch house. An unspoken alliance was forming in the flickering lantern light, a dangerous trust born from shared desperation. She knew she couldn't fight Sable alone, but trusting a Lakota warrior in a town that barely tolerated her as a widow, that was a different kind of risk. Tomorrow they would ride to the upstream trail. Tomorrow they would find out just how deep this theft really ran, and just how much blood the river would demand in return. The sun had just begun its slow crawl over the hills when Maher Red Willow poured water into a tin basin. She watched it ripple with a quiet, burning resentment. Her hands were still scraped raw from the fall. Her ribs ached like they'd been personally cracked by a wagon wheel. But that wasn't what gnawed at her. It was the silence in her own house. Jonas had filled this kitchen once, his voice deep and steady, as reliable as the spring that fed their land. Now, it was just the creak of old wood, the pop of the fire, and the restless tapping of the wind at the windows, like a beggar asking to be let in. Across the room, Wakiza sat by the hearth, wrapping a fresh strip of cloth around his wounded shoulder. He didn't wince. He hadn't made a single sound of complaint all morning. That unsettled her more than blood ever could. "Sugar?" she asked, holding out a tin cup of steaming coffee. He shook his head, his eyes fixed on the flames. "Bitterness has its place." Maher sat across from him, her own chair creaking under years of Jonas's weight. It was a sound that used to comfort her. Now it just felt empty. "How long has he been doing this?" she asked, breaking the silence. "Sable, stealing the flow." "Months," Wakiza said, his voice flat. "Maybe a year. It started slow, one small creek at a time, then our watering holes began to dry up. When my people went to the county board, they laughed at us. They called it a drought." Maher nodded slowly, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. Same lie they fed me. Wakiza's gaze finally lifted from the fire, sharp and still. They want you gone from this land, Maher. They won't get it. He looked at her for a long moment, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Then quietly, we can help each other. Maher hesitated. People in town won't like that. They already don't, he replied, and she couldn't argue with the truth of it. By mid-morning, she'd saddled her mare. Wakiza rode his painted Mustang bareback, moving silent as smoke beside her. They took the High Ridge Trail, heading toward the upper springs where her land began. The wind was colder up there, biting right through their coats and skin. Beneath them, the land stretched out like a tired, broken body. Bones of rock jutted out from the hills, and veins of dry grass curled over the parched earth. At the top of the ridge, they dismounted. Below them, the spring that had once shimmered with life, the source of everything on Thunder Ridge, now barely gurgled. Its edges were cracked mud, the stones wet only in the deepest creases. Maher knelt, scooping up a handful of the weak, tepid water. This should be rushing this time of year, she muttered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Every other spring it overflowed. Wakiza crouched beside her. He didn't touch the water. Instead, he touched the stone where the stream used to spill over, his fingers tracing a line in the dirt. There's an old path, he said, his eyes scanning the landscape to the east. It follows the shadow of Raven Hollow. If the water is vanishing, it's going there. You sound certain. I watched Sable's men hauling iron west 2 months back, he said, his voice hard. Long pipes, covered in straw and lies. Maher stood, dusting the dirt from her hands. A new, more terrible possibility began to form in her mind. You think he buried siphons? I know he did. They rode down into town before sunset, taking the long road around to avoid any of Sable's watchmen. Maher kept her hat pulled low. She hadn't set foot in Father Micah's chapel in weeks, not since the day they buried Jonas. The chapel stood crooked on the edge of town, its steeple leaning like a drunkard against the sky. Micah was outside, mending a fence, when he saw her ride up. Meyer Red Willow, he said, his old eyes squinting at her, then at the man beside her. And with company, no less. Wakiza gave a silent, respectful nod. Father, Maher said, swinging down from her saddle, I need to talk. Micah led them inside. The chapel was empty, save for the dusty cross above the pulpit and a lingering scent of burnt cedar and old regrets. Sable filed a new water claim on my land, she said, once they were seated in a worn wooden pew. You told Jonas you'd seen something. Something wrong in the county records. Micah sighed, a heavy, weary sound. He reached under the pew and pulled out a small, leather-bound ledger. I told him I'd seen documents shift, signatures that didn't match his. He was going to bring it to the council meeting. Meyer's stomach turned to ice. You think that's why he's dead? I think God doesn't always need to say it out loud for us to hear the truth, Micah said, his voice grave. He flipped to a page marked with a faded red ribbon. This is your husband's signature from 5 years ago, he said, pointing to a firm, clear hand. And this? This is the one on the water claims Sable filed last month. Maher stared. Same name, Jonas Red Willow, but it was a different hand, a crude, sloppy forgery. Wakiza leaned over, his eyes scanning the page. This is a crime, he said. It's not enough to prove theft in this county, Micah said bitterly. Not when the sheriff drinks Clayton Sable's whiskey every Saturday night. Maher closed the ledger with a snap. Then we bring proof that even he can't bury. Like what? Micah asked, his expression worried. We go upstream, Wakiza said, his voice like the strike of a match. We follow the missing water, And if it leads to metal and fire, we bring back pieces of it. Micah looked from Wakiza's hardened face to Maher's determined one. You're going to make him desperate, he warned. When the last drop is gone. That's when men like Sable show you who they really are. They left town as the sun touched the mountains, gold bleeding into dusk. Maher rode in silence for a long while, Micah's words echoing in her head. I don't like owing anyone, she said finally, the words costing her something. Wakiza didn't look at her. He just kept his eyes on the trail ahead. Then don't just ride beside me, ride with me. The air was colder now. The land felt thinner, stretched taut like the skin of something wounded. They reached the ranch under the cold light of a rising moon. Inside the barn, Meyer found her ranch hand, Harlan Croft, pretending to stack feed. His hands smelled like cheap liquor and his eyes twitched when she asked where he'd been all day. She didn't press him. Not yet. That night, Maher sat on her porch, watching the moon rise over the hills, her hand resting on the rifle across her lap. She could still hear Micah's warning. When the last drop's gone? Tomorrow they would ride to the base of Raven Hollow. She'd bring Wakiza, and she'd ask him to bring his cousin, Tianita, a woman known for her sharp eyes and even sharper aim. She would dig until the truth bled out of the earth itself, and then she'd load her rifle for war. The morning sky was the color of a bruised plum, swollen with clouds that refused to weep. Meyer Red Willow tightened the straps on her saddle, her fingers raw from the biting cold. The silence between her and Harlan Croft was louder and sharper than the crows gathering on the fence posts. He hadn't looked her in the eye since she'd returned from town, hadn't asked about the fresh bruises on her arms, the missing mule, or the dried blood on her coat. But Mar had noticed the fresh polish on his boots. She'd noticed the faint, lingering smell of rye on his breath at sunrise. She'd known Harlan for 7 years. Jonas had vouched for him back then, called him a hard worker with a busted knee and nowhere else to go. But men could change. Or maybe, she thought, they just reveal who they've been all along when the stakes get high enough. She mounted her horse without a word. Wakiza was already waiting by the ridge trail, his silhouette a sharp, dark line against the pale morning. Beside him, a slim, quiet woman checked the straps on a bedroll tied behind her saddle. It was Tianita, his cousin. She had the eyes of someone who had seen storms build long before the sky ever darkened. Croft will follow us, Wakiza said under his breath as Maher rode up. His voice was a low rumble. You feel it too? She asked, her own senses on high alert. She gave a single, sharp nod. Let him. They rode east, toward the jagged mouth of Raven Hollow. By noon they had crossed into the drylands, where the cottonwoods thinned out and the earth turned to rust. The trail forked near an abandoned skeletal windmill. There, hidden beneath a tangle of old brush and loose stone, Wakiza knelt beside what looked like a simple dry wash. But the sand wasn't natural. He dug with his bare hands, pulling away the loose earth. And then she saw it. Metal. A rusted iron pipe running just beneath the surface, stretching north, straight toward Clayton Sable's land. Meyer knelt beside him, her breath catching in her throat. The pipe was thick, well welded, and old enough to have been hidden for months, maybe longer. He's siphoning water underground, she whispered, the words feeling like a betrayal of the land itself. Pulling it from right under your ranch, Wakiza confirmed. He pressed his ear to the cold metal. Still flowing. Tianita had moved to higher ground, her rifle held loosely in her hands as she scanned the horizon. Riders, she said, her voice calm but urgent. 2 of them, maybe 3, coming fast and low in the saddle. Maher didn't wait to think. We break it, right here, right now. She pulled a small hatchet from her saddlebag and slammed it into the pipe. Again and again and again. The sound echoed across the hollow like a frantic war drum. With a final ringing blow, the metal cracked. Cold water hissed from the gash, spraying into the dry air before slowing to a trickle. The pipe was nearly empty. They weren't just stealing her water, they were stealing all of it. They were draining the valley dry. "Tayanita, stay with the horses," Wakiza commanded. "Like hell," she muttered, loading her rifle with a sharp click. Gunfire cracked from the north. The first bullet hit the dirt just inches from Maher's boots. She hit the ground, rolling, her own rifle in hand. Wakiza returned fire, his shots precise, driving the riders back behind a ridge of stone. From her vantage point, Tayanita dropped to one knee, took a steady breath, and fired. One of the riders slumped from his saddle, a lifeless puppet whose strings had been cut. The others turned tail, kicking up a storm of dirt as they rode off into the dust. Maher stood, her chest heaving, her ears ringing. "Damn good shooting," she said, looking at Tayanita. Tayanita just gave a slight shrug. "Auntie taught me." They dragged the dead man's body into the shade. He carried no badge, no identification. Just a red kerchief, a sharp Bowie knife, and a folded letter in his pocket. It was unmarked, unsigned, addressed simply to C. Maher stared at it, the paper feeling cold in her hand. C is for Clayton. They buried the man in a shallow grave and left no markers. By the time they returned to Thunder Ridge, the sun had dipped low, bleeding color across the western sky. Harland was there, waiting by the barn, looking far too calm. "You have a good ride?" he asked, his voice laced with a false cheerfulness. Maher didn't answer. He smiled, a slow, fake smile that didn't reach his twitching eyes. "Heard a few gunshots echoing through the canyon. Must have been a real adventurous day." Wakiza dismounted without a word. Tayanita walked right past Harland like he wasn't even there. Maher stepped close enough to smell the whiskey on his breath. "You've been talking to Sable?" she asked, her voice low and dangerous. He blinked, but only once. "You accusing me of something, Maher?" She stared right through him. "No. I'm waiting for you to confess." Croft laughed. It was an ugly, forced sound. "Ain't nothing to confess. You're chasing ghosts, Maher. Chasing Indians and lies. You might want to watch yourself." She didn't flinch. "I'm watching you, Harland." Later that night, the three of them sat by the fire pit near the ranch house. The wind carried the scent of mesquite and smoke and the coming storm. Above them, the stars blinked through a thin veil of high clouds. "He's working with Sable," Mayer said, stating it as a fact. "I can feel it in my teeth." "He's giving them movement updates," Wakiza confirmed. "And timing. That ambush wasn't a coincidence." Tayanita spat into the fire. "We should gut him." Maher shook her head, her eyes fixed on the dancing flames. "Not yet. We need him for now. He doesn't know what we know." Wakiza tossed a dry twig into the fire, watching it catch and burn. "A man will trade his soul quicker than his saddle," he said quietly. "If you hit the right nerve." Maher looked into the fire, thinking of Jonas. Thinking of the cool, clear water they once swam in behind the barn, the creek that used to carry their laughter downstream and now carried nothing but dry air. She wasn't grieving anymore. She was getting ready. Tomorrow they would ride to the far edge of Raven Hollow, to the old train trestle, where rumors said Sable's men had been working with dynamite and rail spikes. If the network of pipes led there, and if they found what Wakiza suspected they would find, there'd be no doubt left. Sable wasn't just stealing water, he was building a flood, and someone was going to drown for it. Night had just begun to peel itself off the sky when they reached the mouth of Raven Hollow. Long, skeletal shadows bled across the canyon walls. Mar pulled her duster tight, scanning the ridgeline. The wind howled through the rocks, a low, mournful sound, like a warning no one wanted to say aloud. They tied their horses behind a fallen cedar and continued on foot. Wakiza led the way, his body low and quiet, rifle slung across his back. Tayanita followed a few steps behind, dragging a heavy branch to obscure their footprints in the dust. Maher brought up the rear, her own boots crunching softly over the shale, her revolver tucked tight against her ribs. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. The silence was thick with tension. They moved like that for nearly a mile, until the faint flicker of firelight came into view. Down in the hollow, nestled between jagged boulders, a camp buzzed with movement. Lanterns swayed from ropes strung between makeshift poles, casting dancing, distorted shadows. Men hauled heavy crates from the back of 2 wagons parked under canvas tarps. And at the far end of the camp, rising like a black scar from the earth, was a trestle bridge. It was old, the wood cracked and weathered, but it had been reinforced with fresh timber and new iron spikes. Maher crouched beside Wakiza, her heart starting to pound. "What is this?" He didn't answer. Instead, he pointed to one of the wooden crates stacked near the fire pit. The label stenciled on the side was faint in the flickering light, but it was unmistakable. Dynamite. Handle with care. Tayanita's breath caught in her throat. "You were right," she whispered. "He ain't just siphoning," Maher breathed, the horrifying truth crashing down on her. "He's setting something up." Wakiza nodded slowly, his jaw tight. "He ain't stealing water, Maher. He's building a dam." They watched in silence as 2 men rolled a heavy spool of wire toward the far side of the trestle. Another man knelt near the bridge's main supports, hammering what looked like blasting caps deep into the wood. "This ain't for mining," Maher said, her voice barely a whisper. "No," Wakiza murmured, his eyes dark. "This is sabotage." Raven Hollow wasn't just some work site. It was a trap set for the spring melt. When the snow runoff from the highlands hit, it would surge down the Cheyenne River like a freight train. If they blew the trestle at the right moment, it would create an artificial dam, blocking the narrow canyon. The water would back up, rising higher and higher, and when that dam finally gave out, it would unleash a flood that would scour the entire basin. Maher's land, the Lakota camps downstream, the small settler fields, all of it gone, wiped off the map. "Why the hell would he do this?" Maher whispered, the scale of his cruelty almost impossible to comprehend. Wakiza's voice was flat, devoid of all emotion. "Because dry land is cheap, but drowned land comes up for sale to the highest bidder." They moved, circling to higher ground, careful to stay in the deep shadows outside the lantern glow. From their new vantage point, they could see a large table near the main fire. Pinned to it was a blueprint. Maher pulled a small brass spyglass from her coat pocket. "Plans," she whispered, focusing the lens. "A full layout of the blast." Wakiza pulled a burnt piece of charcoal and a scrap of paper from his own pocket. He began to sketch furiously, copying the shape of the blast zones, noting the wire paths and the placement of the dynamite crates. Tayanita kept her eyes on the tree line. Then she stiffened. Movement. A single figure emerged from the woods behind the trestle, riding hard. Maher's heart turned to a block of ice in her chest. It was Harland Croft. He dismounted near the wagons and handed a folded piece of paper to one of the workers, a burly man with a foreman's swagger. The man nodded and tucked the paper into a leather satchel hanging near the dynamite crates. "That son of a bitch," Maher breathed, a white-hot rage rising inside her. "He's the one feeding them our roots." Wakiza clenched his fist, the charcoal snapping in his hand. "We take the satchel, now." They moved like ghosts, circling wide to avoid the sentries posted at the edges of the camp. As they reached the northern ridge just above the wagons, Maher's boot dislodged a loose rock. It tumbled down the slope, fast, loud, sharp. Voices shouted from the camp below. Lanterns swung in their direction. "Go!" Wakiza hissed. They bolted. Tianita reached the wagons first. She flung open the satchel and stuffed its contents into her coat. Papers, maps, and a roster of patrol shifts. Maher's name was on it, circled in red. Gunfire erupted from the camp. Maher ducked behind a barrel, firing 2 shots back into the darkness to provide cover. Tianita pulled her toward the edge of the camp, but a man stepped directly into their path, his rifle raised. He never got the shot off. Wakiza tackled him from behind, a silent, deadly shadow. There was the flash of a knife, a single choked scream, and then nothing. They ran. By the time they reached the tree line, the whole camp was alive. Men were shouting, bullets were cracking through the air, but they were already gone, vanishing into the dark with blood on their hands and the damning proof in their coats. They rode through the night, pushing their horses hard. Maher's mare stumbled twice on the treacherous terrain. Tianita had a bloody graze on her arm from a ricochet. But they didn't stop. Not until the familiar outline of Thunder Ridge rose before them like salvation in the pre-dawn gloom. They burst through the barn doors to find a figure waiting in the shadows. It was Deputy Silas Brigg. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, stepping back from the sight of them, bloody and breathless. "What happened out there?" Maher threw the stolen satchel onto a dusty workbench. "Sable's building a goddamn bomb," she said, her voice shaking with adrenaline and exhaustion. "Up at Raven Hollow, he's going to flood this entire valley the moment the snow melts." Silas opened the satchel, his hands trembling slightly as he flipped through the maps and plans. "And Croft is in on it," Tianita added, her teeth gritted against the pain in her arm. Silas cursed under his breath, his face pale in the lantern light. "I need time to build a case, time and backup from the federal marshals." "We don't have time," Maher said, her voice rising. "They're finishing the wiring as we speak." Wakiza leaned forward, his voice low and sharp as a razor's edge. "Then we take it down ourselves before they can." Silas hesitated, his eyes wide with fear and indecision. "You do that, you're breaking the law." Mar met his gaze, her own eyes burning with a righteous fire. "You told my husband once the law ain't working here, Silas. So what in God's name are you still waiting for?" Silas didn't have an answer. Later that night, after everyone else had bedded down, Maher sat by the window, the satchel in her lap. She pulled out the patrol roster again, her finger tracing Jonas's name, crossed out. Her own name, circled, and Wakiza's, underlined twice in thick red ink. It wasn't just theft anymore. It was personal, and it would end at that trestle. Tomorrow they would split up. Some would go to sabotage the explosives. Others would ride to draw fire away from them. Maher would ride straight into the heart of Clayton Sable's operation. She closed her eyes, remembering the way her land used to smell after a good rain, the way Jonas used to hum while he brushed down the horses, the way the spring water ran clear and cold and eternal. Now it smelled like rust and dynamite, and if she had to burn Raven Hollow to the ground to stop what was coming, she would. Because she finally saw it with perfect, terrible clarity. This wasn't just about water anymore. It was about power. It was about who got to live and who got washed away. The sky over Thunder Ridge broke with red, not the gentle blush of a healthy sunrise, but a raw, bleeding hue, like the world itself had been cut open and left to bleed out. Maher tightened her scarf against the wind. The bite of it was like 1,000 tiny razors against her skin. The spring melt hadn't started in full force yet, but the air carried its unmistakable warning. The water would rise soon, and if they didn't move now, it would be too late for them all. The plan was simple, but it was steeped in danger. Wakiza and Tianita would hit the wires. They'd slip back into Raven Hollow under the cover of the morning mist and disable the detonator before Sable's men could finish the connections. Meanwhile, Mayor and Deputy Silas would ride for the U.S. Marshal's office in East Fork, 30 miles northeast. The satchel of proof was their only hope. If the feds moved fast enough, they could shut Sable down for good. If not, If we die, Maher said, strapping the precious satchel behind her saddle, we die with the truth in our hands. Wakiza just nodded, his face a grim mask. His arm was wrapped tight from the fight 2 nights back, and though his shoulder was still stiff, his rifle never left his side. Tyanita loaded her pistol, her mouth a thin, determined line. Silas looked between the 3 of them, his face a mixture of fear and resolve. You sure this is the right way? No, Maher said, swinging up onto her horse. But it's the only one we've got. They split at the old ridge marker. Wakiza and Tyanita disappeared like wraiths, heading west into the dark ravine. Maher and Silas pushed north into the wide, dangerous open country. The air felt charged, electric, like lightning was watching them from behind every cloud. It didn't take long for Sable to respond. He must have had eyes everywhere. By midday, Maher spotted them. 2 riders on the horizon, closing in fast. Unmarked horses, shotguns slung low across their saddles. She spurred her mare hard, Silas close behind. They galloped across the plains, the riders gaining on them with every thunderous hoofbeat. They made it to a rock outcropping near Dry Creek, a crumbling wall of shale that offered minimal cover. They leaped from their saddles and ducked behind it just as gunfire echoed across the empty landscape. Bullets kicked up dirt around them, whining as they ricocheted off the rock. Silas returned fire while Mar yanked the satchel free and frantically buried it beneath a thick sagebrush. "They're not going to stop," Silas grunted, reloading his revolver. "They don't have to," Mar replied, her own gun now in hand. "We just have to outlast them." One rider got too brave, coming in too close. Silas stood, took careful aim, and fired. The man crumpled sideways, hitting the ground in a sickening twist of limbs and blood. The second rider, seeing his partner fall, turned and retreated down the hill, leaving behind a trail of dust and curses. Maher didn't wait. She dug out the satchel and mounted her horse in one fluid motion. "Let's move!" They rode for another 5 miles before their horses began to flag. In the distance, the faint blue outline of East Fork shimmered like a mirage. They were almost there. Almost. But Sable wasn't done with them yet. At the edge of Red Butte Pass, the road narrowed, funneling them between 2 sheer cliffs. Maher felt it before she saw it, the way the crows scattered from the rocks above, the sudden unnatural stillness of the wind. "Ambush!" she hissed. It was too late. Gunshots rang out from the cliffs. Silas's horse screamed and dropped, throwing him to the ground. Maher barely had time to dismount before 3 of Sable's men came swarming down from the rocks, their faces covered in dusty bandanas. One grabbed her by the arm. She kicked, twisted free with a snarl, and drew the long knife from her belt. The man lunged. She slashed, catching him across the cheek. Blood sprayed. Silas, on the ground but alive, pulled his revolver and shot the second man in the leg. The third man charged Maher, his own knife glinting in the sun. But he was dropped by a single, perfect bullet that came from above. She looked up, panting, her heart hammering. Wakiza. He stood on the ridge above them, his rifle raised, his eyes burning with a cold, protective fire. "I thought you were—" she started. "We disabled the wires," he called down, already scrambling down the cliff face. "But Tyanita's hurt. She's hiding back near the ravine." Mar nodded, the adrenaline still flooding her limbs. "Help me with Silas." Together they hoisted the wounded deputy onto her horse. Blood was leaking from a wound in his side, but he was still conscious. Maher looked from Silas's pale face to the distant shimmer of East Fork. She made a decision. She handed Wakiza the satchel. "You ride," she said, her voice firm. "You're faster. Get this to the marshal. I'll get Silas back to the ranch." Wakiza looked at her for a long, searching moment. Then he nodded. "Ride hard, Mar." She did. It was near dark when she finally got Silas back to Thunder Ridge. Apaha, Wakiza's aunt, a woman whose hands held generations of healing knowledge, met them at the barn. Her hands were already stained with herbs and blood from treating Tyanita's wound. She worked fast, her quiet chants low and steady. The barn smelled of sweat, earth, and burning sage. "Will he live?" Mar asked, watching Apaha press a poultice to Silas's side. Apaha didn't look up. "If the bleeding stops." Maher stepped outside into the cooling air. The wind had died. The stars had started to show, shy and cold in the vast dark sky. A shadow moved near the paddock. It was Croft. She reached for her gun, but he held up his empty hands. "I didn't know," he stammered, his voice thin and reedy. "I didn't know he was going to kill anyone. I just passed messages, that's all." "You sold out everything Jonas stood for," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "Don't you talk to me about degrees of betrayal. I needed the money. My ranch failed last winter." "You think mine didn't struggle?" Maher stepped forward, her shadow falling over him. "You looked my husband in the eye every day while you helped the man who murdered him." Croft's voice broke. "I didn't pull the trigger." Maher stared at him, her face unreadable. "You may as well have." He dropped his head, the fight gone out of him. "What? What now?" "You leave tonight. Don't pack a single thing. Don't speak to anyone. Just get on your horse and ride until this valley is nothing but a memory." He nodded, shame hanging on him like a wet woolen blanket. He mounted his horse and disappeared down the dark trail without a backward glance. Inside the barn, Silas stirred. He reached out, his hand weak, and gripped Maher's wrist. "I saw it, Maher," he whispered, his voice raspy. "With my own eyes. The blueprints. The detonators. The goddamn timetable." "We have the proof now," she said, her voice softer than she intended. Silas gripped her wrist tighter. "Then you burn this place to the ground before he finishes what he started." Mar sat by his side through the long, dark night. She watched Tianita sleep, her arm bandaged and resting on a pillow. Sometime near dawn, she heard Wakiza's Mustang gallop in. He returned alone. "The marshal's coming," he said, his face grim. "With 10 men. Maher let out a long, shuddering breath, but it wasn't a breath of relief. It wasn't over. Not yet. Because Sable had a timeline. And so did the mountain. When the snow broke, it would all come loose. The river, the bridge, the final fight. And if they didn't stop him at the source, right here on her land, there wouldn't be anything left for the law to save. The storm hit just before dawn. Not from the sky, but from the mountain. The first deep cracks of melting ice echoed down the valley like distant cannon fire. A declaration of war from the earth itself. Maher stood on the ridge above Thunder Ridge Ranch, her eyes fixed on the western peaks. They seemed to be weeping, shedding their winter skin into the earth below. Streams that had been nothing but dry, rocky beds a day ago now shimmered with the first signs of runoff. Cold, relentless, and rising. Wakiza stepped up beside her, his jaw tight. "The melt's begun." Maher didn't answer. She was watching the eastern horizon, watching for riders, for smoke, for any sign that the law was coming with them. There was nothing. Not yet. Behind them, the barn had been turned into a war room. Tianita, still pale but upright, was methodically packing ammunition into cartridge belts. Apaha was mixing herbs and tearing bandages for wounds that hadn't happened yet. And Silas, ghost white and stitched up, lay on a cot with a shotgun propped on one side of him and a bottle of morphine on the other. The whole place smelled like sweat and fury and a deep, simmering fear. Maher turned to Wakiza. "We won't get another shot at this." He nodded, his eyes never leaving the valley below. "Sable knows the law is on the way. He'll make his move before they can arrive." "We intercept him at the trestle," Maher said, her hand instinctively going to the revolver on her hip. "No," Wakiza said, his voice low and certain. "We let him come to us." Maher's eyes narrowed. "You want him to come here?" Wakiza looked down at the sprawling layout of the valley, at the way the riverbed snaked around the ranch. "It's the only place he can finish what he started," he explained. "This ranch sits on the final, crucial bend of the water line. He needs to flood this land first to make sure the land downstream becomes completely worthless." Maher exhaled, a long, heavy breath. "Then we hold the line." They fortified what they could. They moved wagons into makeshift barricades around the main house and barn. They dug out old rifles Jonas had kept hidden under the floorboards. Tianita, using skills her grandmother had taught her, laid hidden traps of rope and wire near the creek bed. Apaha scattered a circle of sacred ash around the main house, whispering ancient words that no one dared to interrupt. By noon, they saw the dust cloud on the horizon. First 5 riders, then 10, then more. A small army on horseback, led by a man in a dark duster and a pristine white hat that had never seen a single speck of dirt. Clayton Sable. He rode like the land already owed him tribute, his eyes calm, his smile thin and cruel. Maher met him at the front gate, alone. "You don't need to do this, Sable," she called out, her voice carrying on the wind. Sable dismounted slowly, methodically brushing imaginary dust from his gloves. "You're right, Mrs. Red Willow," he said, his voice smooth as poison. "I don't need to. I want to." Behind Maher, the dark shadows of rifle barrels moved in the slats of the barn and from the windows of the house. Sable saw them. He didn't care. "I offered you a deal," he said, taking a step closer. "Back when your husband still breathed. You offered him a rope with a handshake." Sable laughed softly, a sound devoid of any humor. "He chose dignity over survival, a foolish trade. But this time, survival is not on the table for you, sweetheart." Maher's voice was ice. "Then come and take what's not yours and see how far you get." Sable tilted his head, a gesture of mock curiosity. "You really believe this worthless piece of land is worth dying for?" "No," Maher said, her hand dropping to her gun. "I believe you are." The first shot didn't come from her. It came from Tianita, positioned high on the ridge. It hit Sable's second-in-command in the thigh, dropping him hard from his horse. And then the ranch exploded into chaos. Rifles fired from every direction. Horses screamed and reared, men shouted, scattering for cover as bullets ripped through the wooden barricades. Wakiza moved like lightning, a blur of motion flanking the far edge of the attack, cutting through Sable's riders like a hot knife through butter. Maher ducked behind a wagon, her heart pounding, her ears ringing. She picked off one man, then another, the recoil of the rifle a brutal comfort against her shoulder. It was war, plain and cruel, and fought on her own front porch. Sable didn't flinch. He moved through the hail of gunfire as if he were taking a Sunday stroll, as if he already knew the ending to this story. At one point, he calmly stopped, picked up a wounded man's revolver, and fired a single shot toward the barn. Maher saw Silas fall. She screamed, a raw, ragged sound of fury, and fired back, hitting Sable in the arm. He ducked, grinned, and disappeared behind the smoking remains of the chicken coop. Silas was dying. Maher crawled to him as the fight raged on around them. "Tell the marshal," he wheezed, blood bubbling on his lips. "Tell him. You were right, Maher." She pressed her hand to his chest, trying to stop the bleeding. "You're not done yet, Silas." But he was. She stood up, soaked in his blood and her own bottomless rage. The barn was on fire now, thick black smoke billowing into the sky. Tianita limped from behind a water trough, one arm hanging uselessly at her side. Apaha was dragging the wounded, both theirs and Sable's, behind the relative safety of the corral, chanting prayers in the old tongue. Maher found Wakiza near the spring. Sable was there too. The three of them faced each other in a tense triangle, guns drawn, the battle momentarily forgotten. "You could have walked away," Sable said, bleeding from his shoulder but still standing tall. taken your little tribe and your grief and faded away, like the rest of your kind. Wakiza's voice was as hard as stone. We don't fade, we wait. And now, you've run out of time. Sable raised his pistol to fire at Wakiza. Maher fired first. The shot hit him clean in the chest. He staggered back, a look of genuine disbelief on his face. He looked down at the blossoming red stain on his white shirt as if he couldn't comprehend it. Then he dropped. The world held its breath. No one moved. No birds. No wind. Just the crackling of the fire and the sound of running water from the nearby spring. It was over. Maher dropped her gun. She fell to her knees, her breath coming in short, ragged bursts, not from pain, but from the sudden, crushing release of it all. Wakiza came to her side and gently touched her shoulder. You held the line. She looked up at him, tears and ash streaking her face. We all did. They buried Silas near Jonas. Apaha sang a low, mournful song. Tayanita lit bundles of cedar and sage, letting the sacred smoke cleanse the blood from the air. And the water, the sweet, cold water, began to flow again from the edge of the hill. Not a flood, not an act of destruction, just life returned. That night, Maher sat on what was left of her porch, staring at the stars. Wakiza handed her a flask. You earned this. She took a long sip of the burning whiskey. He asked me if I thought this land was worth dying for, she said, her voice quiet. He never understood. It was never about the land. Wakiza leaned back against a charred porch post. No, he said, his eyes on the constellations. It was about not letting a man like him decide who gets to stay alive. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of justice from the shadows.